Okay, so let's talk about fermentation for a minute. So fermentation happens when there's no oxygen present. So if you notice on this crazy diagram, where was oxygen? Well, it was right here waiting at the bottom of the electron transport chain to receive the electrons down the chain. And so if we don't have oxygen, what happens is the electron transport chain totally shuts down. So this whole part shuts down. And because electrons are not being taken from our NADH, then there's no way they can break the bonds in the citric acid cycle because there's nowhere for the electrons to go. So this all shuts down. And likewise, this all shuts down. So everything in the mitochondria shuts down. So the question becomes, can we make ATP without the mitochondria? And it turns out that, yeah, if you remember, there's a tiny bit of ATP by substrate level phosphorylation that happens to be made during glycolysis. And so we do make a tiny bit of ATP. And so that's what we can do to stay alive. So if you're like holding your breath and being an idiot, your brain is starting to suffocate, and so it starts to do glycolysis as fast as possible. And so what happens, though, is as this builds up, in order for glycolysis to continue to happen to make this ATP, these electrons have to go somewhere so that your products don't start building up. And so what happens is the electrons from the NADH get added back to the pyruvate, and that turns the pyruvate into a substance called lactic acid. And so as we ferment, we produce lactic acid. It's kind of thick, like bacon grease. It solidifies in your muscles and makes you sore. That's why you're supposed to stretch after anaerobic type exercise, where you're like sprinting, for instance. You're supposed to stretch so you can get that lactic acid out of your system. Anyway, so that's lactic acid. If you were a yeast or some other type of cell, you might put it onto there and turn it into ethanol, which is also how fermentation happens. But that whole process is called fermentation.